Welcome to Ask the Educator, a podcast brought to you by Healthmark Industries. Are you a sterile processing technician or manager? Maybe you work in infection prevention or biomedical engineering. Whether you're a frontline tech, endoscopy tech, OR nurse, or surgical services administrator, you undoubtedly have influence in medical device processing at your facility. In each episode, we speak with experts from the Healthmark Clinical Affairs team, industry leaders, or special guests from the trenches to answer your questions and bring you relevant industry information, equipping you for excellence in medical device processing. My name is Kevin Anderson, and I will be your host. Now let's get started. Hey everyone, welcome back to the Ask the Educator podcast. With me on this episode, I have fellow clinical educators, Seth Hendee and Adam Okada. We're going to get into IFUs in this episode. Seth and I were discussing, and of course, Adam and the whole group here at Healthmark has been out and about in facilities and seeing what's going on. And a topic came to mind to Seth, and it just resonated with me. And that's all about IFUs, but not the way you think. We're not going to spend this episode just bashing how bad IFUs are written or things like that. That is definitely a whole nother subject matter in and of itself. But one of those things that we find regarding IFUs is people's competency around that. So in order to kind of kick that off, I'll hand it over to Seth. Seth, what have you been seeing out there in the field when it comes to IFUs?
Thanks, Kevin. Biggest thing is the amount of pride that's initially shown when we ask about IFUs and how do you keep your IFUs, and someone says they're all electronic, they're all digital, right? Now the big name in the room that we all know is one source, but there's others, and again, beaming with pride that they have one source. And I say that's great. So if I were to ask this technician at the workstation here to help us out, they would be able to access an IFU. And that's where the stumbling and sometimes the outright falling begins. The staff come along, they can't remember the password, some of the very basic things. And then even the ones that do, because it's posted somewhere or they have it on their badge, they enter into the program and then find 5 or 6 drop-down menus that they're not familiar with. And so even if they're able to access it, really following it through and pulling up a specific IFU is very, very difficult for many of them.
Yeah, this is a thing that I've been witness to as well as in my travels. So Adam, what about you? Is this something that you're commonly seeing as well throughout your years going back to consultations and also being the educator in a department?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's not only just having the program and being able to access the program. It's can you maneuver inside of that program? I think that's the tricky part. And, once you get in there, can you actually look up a specific part number, a specific vendor? Are you able to look up that camera that you're now looking for that IFU? And so many technicians, I think, have that confidence, that pride, like Seth was saying, they have that confidence, like we have one source, we're totally immune from any kind of survey issues.
Right.
But then you have to be able to actually, when they ask you, hey, where's your IFU for this specific thing, you have to actually be able to pull it up. And if you can't pull it up, then that one source that you have is, wonderful to have, but it didn't help you in that situation.
Yeah, I agree. So like I said, I've seen the exact same thing. And I think one of the reasons for this is I think years ago, surveyors would come in and their expectation was that the IFUs were available. And if they were available, that was good, right? But I think what's going on is now that they're generally available, people have caught on to that. So they purchase the one source subscription, or they do all the work and organize all their IFUs in some sort of physical filing system or digital filing system. And they're all excited about it. But then when you get to the down and dirty, like how do you actually do this thing? That's where people stumble a lot. And I want to say, like, we had a little bit of conversation, obviously, about this prior to. And one of the things that I've seen sometimes is when I go into a facility, they'll plant certain people in front of you that are comfortable with answering that question. But every once in a while, and probably more often than not, honestly, is they stumble like crazy. I know, Seth, you had a pretty good story of this happening recently where someone was looking for a password or something like that, but it happened just recently, right?
Oh, absolutely. So I was standing there with the supervisor who was helping us with our CPR, and I asked about IFUs, and they said, "Yeah, we've got them digitally." And I said, "And the staff feel comfortable about pulling it up?" And she said, "Absolutely." And so I pointed at someone randomly, and I said, "Can you come over here and help us?" The first part that was interesting is I said, "Okay, I'd like you to pick any item that you want, and please look up a specific IFU for me." And so there was a pause in front of the computer, and what I see is the supervisor tapping on their badge. And at first, I'm trying to figure out what's going on until the technician looks down and says, "Oh, that's right. My information to get in is here." And so they had the password and the username on their badge. That got to step one. And when the program opened, I said, "Great, now let's pull up an IFU." And we, again, fell short at step two. And there's still several. In these conversations we've had, you brought it up, Kevin. Even if you can access it, let's say you get down to that IFU level, can they read it? Because there's another level there too. So even though we have this, how far can we take this as far as it should go? And that's right down to the step level, and we know that's missing.
Right. And you bring up a good point as far as reading it. They're capable of reading it, but what do they know to look for? Like, one of the things that came to my mind about this is historically, when we thought of IFUs, and I'm guilty of this as well, but when I asked my staff back in the day, did you look at the IFU? Did you get the IFU from the rep for the loaner tray or what have you? And they're like, "Oh yeah." And I'm like, "Well, what's required? Do we need to do anything?" And they'd rattle off the sterilization parameters like 270 at 4 minutes and 30. So we're good. And I'm like, "Well, what about all the other stuff? Like manual cleaning? What about automated cleaning? What about inspection? What about all of that stuff?" And that's where there are a lot of hidden gems in those sections, like automated washer parameters. Like there's pre-wash, there's wash 1, wash 2, there's thermal disinfection. There's all these different things. And we talked about it before, but there's also inspection instructions. We were just looking at shavers in a department, and in the IFU, it mentions you have to inspect the internal surfaces with a scope, basically. So you have to put a scope inside the shaver and look inside, but no one knew that. They had access to one source, but couldn't find that portion of it in the IFU. And Adam, I'm sure you have similar experiences with this.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is like an updated version of the old problem that we used to have with IFUs, which was, oh, the IFUs, we have them, but they're sitting in the manager's office behind a locked door, so nobody overnight or nobody on later shifts can access them, or on the weekends. That was the old problem. And then we got this digital system. But it's a similar thing. We've created sort of a door that they can't get through, where they're not looking at these specific parts of the IFU. And there's so many different things. I mean, I know specifically a couple of things that I found in IFUs that I had no idea were there. At one facility, we were looking up IUSS instructions for a robotic instrument. And so we were looking through the IFU and we were trying to find, does it say immediate use anywhere, any type of like shortened cycle, anything? And there weren't any. I called the robotic company. I said, "Hey, we can't find any IUSS instructions." And they were like, "Yeah, we didn't put any in." So if you don't have them, you really should not be IUSSing that specific thing. But you wouldn't know that unless you looked at the IFU. And that's the thing that I'm really trying to find an answer for, is these facilities where they can't access them. How are they processing things? And my guess is that it's probably not according to the instructions for use, because it's really hard to follow all of them.
Yeah, exactly. And you brought up a couple good points. There is one, what do you even do when you have a question about an IFU, or maybe you don't have one source access to IFUs? As you guys know, as users of one source, there are sometimes the occasions where you're looking for an item and it just doesn't pop up. They don't have an agreement with one source or whatever. What's that next step you have to do? You have to call the manufacturer. You have to reach out to them. So that is another step that we should be quizzing our staff on, whether or not they know how to do those things. Because guess what? Manager or educator or supervisor, whoever, sometimes they've gone home and then a loaner's dropped off and there's nothing else you can do or whatever. You have to be able to troubleshoot those situations on your own. So one of the things that I think is really important about discussing topics like this and access to IFUs, how to use it, and all of those things, is getting to the how do we fix this problem. I think it's one of those things that all of us are generally pretty well aware of now. For us, it's front of mind because we're going into all these departments and we're asking the same questions over and over, and we see it over and over. But we want to be able to give people some actionable steps, some advice. How do we curb this issue? How do we prepare our staff better for not only accessing the IFU, but getting a better competence around it? Because we know it's tricky. Like, there's different databases now. You got to search, you got equipment, you got surgical instruments, you got dental instruments, you have all these other databases now and all that stuff. So it's an important skill set to have. So Seth, why don't you help us give some advice to our listeners? How do we fix this problem?
Absolutely. I'm going to steal the easy one, Adam. So if he asked you next, I apologize that I'm taking the easy road here. But Kevin just mentioned it a little bit. It's initial training and ongoing competence. Again, we talk about that with processing instruments, and especially our difficult ones, right? Oh, I do a yearly in-service on all of my robotic arms, and we do a in-service every year, every flexible scope with Olympus. Or why is this database? Why is using it? Why is understanding and reading IFUs any different than a skill that should be taught and then reviewed periodically? And then when your competence is good, there you go. And I know that that's a little easier. It's easier to say than it sounds, as a guy who spent nearly 3 months out of every year working on competencies in his, you're thinking now Seth wants me to add one more. Sadly, yes, I do. Because if they can't use this system, it doesn't do what we need it to do, right? That's the whole point.
I agree, Seth. I think training and competency are huge. And I think it's a great opportunity with IFUs to use those tools that we are already using for other things and apply it to IFU access and competence. So I think that's a great suggestion. What about you, Adam? Do you have any other kind of tricks up your sleeve that you've tried in the past with this?
Well, Steph already stole my answer, so I mean, I feel like I'm at a loss, but no, I mean, it is. I stole this from an educator that I worked with earlier in my career, where we actually did have, when we came into the facility, part of our onboarding was that we had a competency to show how to get into one source, and then could you download instructions and show them to the educator. That was actually part of that initial competency. And then it was ongoing as well. So anytime we started our survey window, we had an in-service, and they would show us on the screen, how do you access the IFUs in one source? And then again, we had to do a competency where all of us had to go through and actually print that IFU so that we could show it to the educator. And I feel like that's the missing part that people are probably not engaging with right now, is they have the program, but are the staff actually able to print the IFU that they're needing to find? Because that's when the surveyor comes in. They do want to know how you're doing things. That's always the first question, right? How do you process this?
Yep.
Okay. And then the second question is, how do you know that's how you process this?
Right.
And that is where the part where the tech needs to be able to print or show that IFU to say, this is the reason why. And, that's a key step for a survey. And obviously, ongoing education and competency really do help with that.
Yeah, it's practice, right? I mean, you do the training, the competency, and then you have to practice, just like a nurse has to practice, or a scrub tech has to practice, or even a new sterile processing tech has to practice manual decontamination or using the ultrasonic or what have you. We should be applying those same practice principles to the IFUs and how to access them, how to read them, how to understand them, and how to apply them. One of the things that I will just share really quickly that we tried in our department that was pretty successful, I think it wasn't 100% successful. I think if it was coupled with the things that we've already discussed here, it would work even better. But one of the things we did was we highlighted an IFU of the devices that we were processing each month. And so they would have to do a read and sign of the printed IFU. And then we would discuss portions of it at each huddle throughout the month. So it wasn't just what are the sterilization parameters. We would be discussing all the hidden gems in there as well. I think I told you guys one of them was we came across an IFU that said we had to ultrasonicate this device at 50 kilohertz. 50 kilohertz. Well, Why is it that specific? Most ultrasonic machines and SPD work at 40 kilohertz or 38 kilohertz. So where did this 50 come from? And so that triggered a call to the manufacturer and all this stuff. But those are the kinds of things that you find when you get down and dirty into the IFUs and really dig for the information in there. So I think that would be another excellent way to raise the level of awareness and competence around IFUs. But Seth, we had discussed this, and this kind of same issue presents itself with some other things. Before we close the interview, I did want to give you the opportunity to share that because it is so closely related and makes a lot of sense that we touch upon it here before we close out.
Absolutely. What else are we doing digitally now? Because we have the capabilities, right? And so this really applies to anything that you're applying that mode to. Are they looking up? Are your staff looking up internal policies and procedures on the intranet? Well, I have to tell you, if your intranet was anything like ours, it was still a very layered process, right? There were drop downs, there were specific paths to take to get where you were going. And if you took the wrong one, same as in real life, you were lost, right? And so I just honestly take a half step back and say, wait a minute, is this just an IFU database, or is everything that we do digitally really need the same kind of attention? And if you think about it, in a critical thinking mind, you're going to go, oh, these all need this, don't they?
Yeah. One that comes to my mind was we used to call it the MSDS, but then it changed to SDS. Adam, did you think of any other ones that come to mind? I'm sure there are others, but I'm just like, yeah, this kind of issue that we've uncovered applies in other areas. It's just one of those things. It just does. There's other aspects that we need to worry about that fall in the same category.
Yeah, the SDS is a perfect one because, again, it's something that the staff knows where it is. That's always part of the initial training. We have SDS, and when we have it digitally, it's so nice that we can click on this little link and it sends us to the SDS. But once you're in that SDS, do you know how to look up this specific chemical and find the IFUs and the safety for the instructions for that specific chemical? Because that's really the key part of that. And then the other one I think is ST79. If you guys, a lot of hospitals have the AV documents digitally now. And, it's great for the managers to be able to access it, but the staff on the floor should also be able to look up those guidelines. And that's another one, like they have to know what the password is. They have to be able to get into it and have to be able to interpret and get through that document. So, there's a lot of them, SDS, IFUs, AMI documents. There's a lot of those digital things we have now, policies and procedures. All of those have to have a step-by-step. And staff needs to be able to go through and find what they need, not just be able to access the program, but find the thing that they need within it.
Excellent. Thank you guys so much, Seth and Adam, for joining me on this one. I think we gave our listeners some direction here that will be helpful, training, competence, and practice, and get into those digital IFUs, operating procedures, SDS, all those things, and improve your staff's level of competence. And good luck with your accreditation surveys out there. But thanks again, guys, for joining me. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Kevin.
That wraps up our IFU discussion with Adam Okada and Seth Hendee. Just to recap this episode, we want to make sure that our listeners understand it is no longer good enough to have access to current IFUs for all equipment and instruments. You and your SPD technicians need to have the ability to open, navigate, and find the information that matters in the IFU. We recommend that you have specific training for IFU retrieval and documented competency with return demonstration. That way, when a surveyor asks you to look up an IFU, instead of getting that sinking feeling in your stomach and that deer in the headlights look, you can find what you need with confidence. We hope you enjoyed this episode. I want to invite you all to subscribe to the podcast, but also head on over to our YouTube channel, Healthmark Education, and check out the latest sterile processing quick tips series. While you're there, please subscribe to the channel and feel free to comment and ask any questions that you may have. Thank you all for listening. All opinions expressed on this show are those of the presenters Before using any medical device, it is important to review the device manufacturer's instructions for use.